The distress beacon came in on a dead frequency. That was the first wrong thing. Frequency 7 null had been retired from the Frontier Relay grid after the Kareth incident, when the Sovereignty decided that anything broadcasting on it was either a ghost or a trap. Most patrol medics would have logged it, tagged it non-urgent, and passed it up the chain. Most patrol medics hadn't been quietly reassigned to the Outer Verge run specifically because the brass wanted them somewhere they couldn't embarrass anyone. Decker Cole had been out here for 11 months. He had learned that embarrassment was relative. He pulled the beacon feed through the console's secondary receiver, the one the Sovereignty techs hadn't bothered to lock out when they downgraded his posting. The signal was irregular, not the clean digital pulse of a modern distress system, but something older, analog almost, with a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat if you listened long enough. He listened long enough. "Nav," he said, "give me a course to that signal origin." The ship's navigation intelligence paused in the way it always did when it thought he was about to do something inadvisable. "Commander Cole, frequency 7 null is a deprecated." "I know what it is. Course, please." Another pause. Then the numbers appeared on his secondary screen, and Decker swung the ardent claws out of its patrol corridor and aimed it at whatever was broadcasting from the dark. He found the vessel 40 minutes out, drifting in the shadow of a brown dwarf that didn't even have a proper designation, just a catalog number and a notation that it was gravitationally inert and of no commercial interest. The drifting ship was roughly the size of a Sovereignty heavy cruiser, but the design was nothing Decker had ever seen in any recognition file. The hull was a deep gray-green, organic in its curves, and something about the way the running lights had failed made it look less like a dead ship and more like a sleeping one, the kind of sleep that isn't peaceful. He hailed it, no response. He scanned it, life signs unclear, structural integrity partial, atmosphere present in approximately 40% of interior volume. Contaminants. His scanner returned an anomalous reading, a biological agent of unknown classification, present in elevated concentrations in the lower decks. That was the second wrong thing. A prudent medic would have logged it, tagged it biohazard, and called for a containment team. Decker was a medic. He had 8 years of field experience, a box of proper contamination gear that the Sovereignty had actually left him fully stocked, and the inescapable fact that if there was anyone alive on that ship, calling for a containment team meant they'd be dead before the team arrived. He suited up, he went across. The docking collar sealed badly. The other ship's hull was slightly the wrong geometry, as if designed for a docking system that didn't match anything in the Sovereignty's catalog, and he had to burn through a secondary seal to get the connection to hold. The corridor on the other side smelled wrong through his suit sensors, a sweetish, slightly rotten chemical signature that his analyzer couldn't match to anything in its library. The first crew members he found were in the forward corridor, and he understood immediately that they had not died peacefully. The walls carried the record of it, the staining patterns, the blast marks that weren't burns but something else, something biological. He had seen battlefield injuries. He had seen decompression fatalities. He had seen what happened when a reactor coolant line failed near a populated crew compartment. What he was seeing now was not any of those things. He moved deeper. The ship was laid out in a way that made a kind of intuitive sense once you stopped expecting it to match human conventions. Command functions were at the center rather than the nose. Engineering was above rather than below. And the deeper into the ship he moved, the more of the crew he found, all dead, all bearing the same catastrophic tissue failure, all positioned as if they had been trying to reach the central compartment from different directions. He found the survivor in the room at the exact center of the ship. She was sealed inside a containment enclosure, not a brig, he thought, but something that functioned similarly, a transparent barrier that separated her from the rest of the compartment, and therefore from the rest of the atmosphere. an emergency isolation unit, or the alien equivalent thereof. Someone had sealed it from the inside. She was alive, barely. Through the transparency, he could see a being that was clearly not human, but not so alien as to defy recognition. Bipedal, approximately his height, features arranged in a configuration that was bilateral, symmetrical, the eyes large, and positioned for a wider field of view than human standard. Her skin was a deep pewter blue, and in the failing light of the emergency bays, it seemed almost to hold a faint luminescence at the edges, like light remembering itself. She was dressed in something that might have been a uniform once, though the distinction between clothing and armor was unclear. The material was dense, layered, and almost certainly more structural than ornamental. She had been injured. The contamination had reached her before she'd managed to seal the enclosure. He could see the tissue damage on her exposed forearm, a spreading darkening that his scanner identified as the same biological agent he'd found throughout the ship, now working its way through a living system. Her eyes opened when he moved to the barrier. They were amber, with a vertical pupil that expanded slowly as it adjusted to the light. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read but recognized. It was the expression of someone who had accepted a particular outcome and was surprised to find it might not be the only one. He checked the barrier seal, found the emergency release, standard enough in concept, just differently executed, and made a decision. He cracked the seal, he went in. What followed was the longest hour of Decker Cole's professional life. The contaminating agent. He was already thinking of it as the spore, for the simple reason that his scanner's closest biological match was a reproductive spore structure, although a spore that seemed to be purpose-built rather than evolved, had a highly specific mechanism of action. It didn't simply attack tissue. It infiltrated the cellular signaling network and rewrote the communication structure between cells, essentially teaching the body to destroy itself in a particular sequence. The process was elegant in a way that he found deeply troubling, even as he was working to stop it. Stopping it required counteracting the cellular signal cascade before it reached the critical organ systems. He had 3 compounds in his kit that could theoretically achieve that. He'd used them for xenobiological exposures before, though never for anything like this. He used all 3, in a sequencing that he worked out as he went, checking the scanner readings after each application, adjusting. The being did not resist. She was barely conscious for most of it, in and out in a way that suggested the contamination had been progressing for some time before he'd found her. But in the moments when she surfaced, her amber eyes found him each time, and the expression on her face remained consistent. Not gratitude exactly, which he understood might not even be a concept that translated. Something closer to assessment. She was watching him work, and she was deciding something about what she saw. Twice during the process she spoke. He couldn't understand a word of it, whatever language she was using. His translator had nothing to match it to. The sounds were low, resonant, with a harmonic quality that felt almost structural rather than vocal, but her tone was clear enough. The first time she spoke, it was a question. The second time, about 40 minutes in, when his 3rd compound started to show results on the scanner, it was something else. He didn't have a word for it. The closest human thing he could think of was acknowledgement. By the time he had her stable enough to move, the ship's emergency power had dropped to 30%, and the gravity field in the central compartment was beginning to fluctuate. "We need to go," he said, pointing at the corridor. "My ship." She understood that at least. She stood slowly, with a deliberate steadiness that told him she was imposing composure rather than feeling it, and she followed him out. He got her aboard the Ardent Claws and put her in the medical bay, which was the largest private space on the ship and the one with the best environmental control. He reset the atmospheric composition to something close to what the alien ship's air had been before contamination, based on the readings his suit sensors had recorded. She seemed to breathe easier. Then he sat in the crew compartment outside the medical bay, drank 2 cups of the terrible reconstituted coffee that was all the sovereignty provisioned for outer verge runs, and tried to decide what to do. Reporting in was the obvious answer. He had found and recovered an alien survivor from an alien vessel. That was unambiguous first contact protocol territory, which was far above his pay grade, and exactly the sort of situation the chain of command existed to handle. He pulled up the comm panel. He started composing the report. He got as far as recovered 1 survivor, alien species, unknown origin before his scanner, which he'd left running on the medical bay, threw an alert. He went back in. She was awake, sitting upright on the diagnostic bed, and she had found the scanner display panel on the wall. She was reading it, or doing something that looked functionally identical to reading it, with an expression of focused attention that had nothing uncertain in it. When he entered, she looked up at him, and this time the assessment in her eyes was different, more complete. She said something. He opened his translator on full-spectrum acquisition mode, which meant it was recording every phoneme and harmonic and building a pattern model in real time. He'd used it before for first contact scenarios. The Sovereignty trained all its frontier medics in the protocol, even the ones it sent to the outer verge to be forgotten. Then she did something he didn't expect. She reached up to a point just below her left ear, pressed 2 fingers to it, and a faint light pulsed there. A device of some kind, built into or under the skin. She spoke again, and this time the translator caught something. Not the words, not yet, but a structure underneath the words, a frequency pattern that the model identified as a universal grammar base. You, she said, slowly, in standard, with an accent that suggested the language was entirely new to her but that she was applying extraordinary processing power to it. Saved me. I tried, Decker said. You're not out of the woods yet. The compound I used will need follow-up treatment in about 6 hours or the cascade could restart. She processed this. He watched her doing it, not the blank pause of someone failing to comprehend, but the focused interval of someone taking information apart and rebuilding it. Woods, she said then. Danger, still danger. Yes, still some danger. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? It wasn't a question about the danger. He understood that. He thought about how to answer it. You were alive, he said finally. That was enough. Something shifted in her expression. Something that he thought, if he'd seen it on a human face, he might have called cracking, not breaking, not collapsing, but the very specific, very controlled adjustment of a person who is recalculating something they thought they had already finished calculating. Her name, as best his translator could render it, was something like Vorya. He didn't try to shorten it. It was her name. Over the next 6 hours, as he administered the follow-up treatment and the translator built its model, she told him about the ship. The vessel had been a scientific expedition, her scientific expedition, though she was vague about her role in it. They had been surveying a region of space several sectors beyond the Sovereignty's mapped frontier when they'd encountered the source of what she called, in a translated phrase that made his blood drop a few degrees, the seeding. The seeding was what had been aboard the derelict cargo ships that had started showing up on the frontier 3 years ago, always drifting, always dead. The Sovereignty's intelligence services called it an anomalous biological event and kept the details classified. Decker had heard rumors on his last posting before the outer verge, the kind of rumors that circulate among medics, because medics deal with the bodies that command doesn't want to explain. He'd heard about a ship out of the Kalen station, whose crew had all died in a manner consistent with catastrophic simultaneous organ failure. He'd heard about an agricultural colony that had found something in its soil samples and stopped responding to hails. He'd filed those rumors under things he didn't have the clearance to investigate and left them there. Vorya's people had found the source. A network, she said, her standard gaining fluency by the hour in a way that was frankly unnerving. Not a single entity, a distributed architecture. What you would call, she paused, working through her internal translator, a hive but intentional, designed, the Volkai. What do they want? Her amber eyes were steady. What every distributed biological network wants, to expand, to propagate, to contaminate available systems with their own architecture. She touched the healing tissue on her forearm, the skin still slightly dark where the spore had worked. The eggs are the delivery mechanism. The spores inside them are the rewriting tool. Every biological system they contact is converted, not killed. Converted, rewritten at the cellular level into a node of the network. Except you didn't convert. No, a pause, nor did the others at first. The spore took 3 days to complete its work on a sovereignty human in the incident you know as the Kaelan Station event. On my people, the resistance is longer, but it completes. Not if I can help it. The look she gave him was one he would think about for a long time afterward. The Volkai's expansion route was not random. Vorya had mapped it before her ship was boarded. She used that word with a precision that told him the attack had been deliberate, targeted, not coincidence. The seeding front was moving toward the dense population corridors of the sovereignty's inner systems, but more than that, it was moving toward a specific region of her people's space. An area she didn't name but that she indicated on his star map with a single pressed fingertip. The center of her civilization, not just a populated area, the center. They know where to hit, Decker said. They always know, Vorya said. The Volkai do not plan, they do not strategize, they simply respond to resistance with concentration. Every point of resistance they have encountered has become a focus of greater seeding density. They are learning the shape of opposition and filling it. Is there a way to stop them? She was quiet for a moment. Outside the medical bay's porthole, the brown dwarf turned with geological patience, indifferent. The Volkai network requires coherence, she said finally. Distributed but coherent, a single shared frequency that allows the nodes to communicate and orient. Remove that coherence and the network collapses. Each spore becomes isolated. Each converted system becomes inert. She touched the device beneath her ear again. I know the frequency. I have known it since I found the source point. That is why they boarded my ship. That is why they used the seeding on my crew not to convert, but to prevent me from. She stopped. From telling someone, Decker said. From acting, she looked at him directly. The coherence frequency can be disrupted, but the disruption must occur at the source point. At the Volkai's originating node, the location from which the entire network takes its orientation signal. Another pause. I know where it is. I have the equipment to disrupt it. I had both before they boarded me. And now, the equipment is on the ship. Still functioning, the Volkai do not destroy, they convert. My ship systems were scheduled for conversion, not destruction. If we return, they'll be there. Yes. Decker looked at the star map for a long time. He thought about the report he hadn't finished filing. He thought about the 12 months he'd spent on the outer verge, quietly, doing his job, not embarrassing anyone. He thought about Kaelan Station and the agricultural colony and all the rumors he'd filed away. He thought about a woman who had sealed herself in a containment unit and waited to die alone rather than let the seeding spread from her ship, and who had still, even through that, kept her beacon running, just in case. Tell me about the equipment, he said. Going back to the alien vessel was the third wrong thing, and Decker did it anyway. He brought his full contamination kit. He brought the 3 compounds, and a fourth that Vorya had synthesized from his medical stores using a process she explained to him step by step, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the only person available to assist her was going to have to understand what they were doing. He brought the cutting torch he used for hull emergencies. He brought his sidearm, which he'd never fired in 11 months on the outer verge, because there'd never been anything to fire it at. Vorya brought herself, which he was starting to understand was considerably more than it appeared. The docking collar re-engaged with the alien vessel's secondary port, the one with proper geometry, which she directed him to with a precision that suggested she knew every attachment point on this ship from memory. They went aboard together. The Vorkai were waiting. Not as soldiers, not as beings in any conventional sense. The conversion had been faster than Vorya had expected. 3 of her surviving crew members had been in the process of cellular rewriting when she'd sealed her containment unit, and in the hours since, the spore had completed its work. They were not her crew anymore. They moved with a coherence that was biological, not trained, the slightly too synchronized gait of nodes in a network, each one oriented toward the same signal, each one responding to his and Vorya's presence in the same instant. "Don't let them touch you," he said, which was obvious, but saying obvious things was a habit he'd developed in field medicine, because silence in a crisis was its own kind of lie. "The equipment is in the central compartment," she said. "The node I need is the primary signal emitter I placed there before the boarding, if it is intact." "How do we know?" "We don't," she said. "We go and we find out." He thought this is what soldiers must feel like, not brave, just committed. He went first. The corridors of the alien ship were different with living presences in them. The converted crew tracked their movement in a way that wasn't quite pursuit, more like orientation, like compass needles pointing. Every time Decker and Vorya changed direction, the converted beings in the corridors adjusted, not rushing, not attacking, just keeping them centered in their awareness. It was the most unsettling thing he'd ever experienced, and he had once performed emergency surgery on a wounded man, while the man's commanding officer stood 3 feet away holding a weapon and making suggestions. "They're hurting us," he said. "Yes," Vorya said, "toward the lower decks. Away from the central compartment. So we don't go to the lower decks." "That is my intention." They found a maintenance passage that ran parallel to the main corridor. Vorya moved through it with the ease of someone who had designed this ship, or at least memorized it, and they came out directly behind the orientation of the converted crew members who had been tracking them. Decker understood, watching the converted beings' confusion as their target vanished from the expected trajectory, that the Volkai network was sophisticated in ways that were difficult to define but had a particular weakness. It was entirely response-based. It could not predict. It could only react. And the 3-second lag between his and Vorya's disappearance from expected position and the network's reorientation was enough. They reached the central compartment. The equipment was intact. A device roughly the size of a field medical kit, mounted to the wall above the compartment's central console, with a display that was still running and a status indicator that Vorya read in an instant. "Operational," she said, and for the first time since he'd found her in the containment unit, he heard something underneath her controlled precision that was close to relief. "How does it work?" "It emits a countersignal at the Volkai coherence frequency. The disruption propagates through the network from this point, not immediately, but within hours, the nodes lose coherence. The spore becomes inert. The converted recover if the conversion is not too far advanced." She paused at the console. "Some will not recover. Some is better than none." "Yes," she said quietly, "some is better than none." She began working the device. Behind them, he heard the corridor sounds change, the soft, terrible coherence of the converted crew's movement, drawing closer now, no longer hurting, now aware that something at the center of the network was being threatened. He positioned himself at the compartment entrance and watched the corridor. The first converted crew member appeared at the far end, then 2 more from the opposite direction. They didn't run. They accelerated in that smooth, organic, deeply wrong way bodies built for one purpose being used for another. Decker raised his sidearm. He had never been a soldier. He had been a medic for 11 years, and his job had always been to keep people alive. He stood in the entrance to that compartment, and he felt everything that was human about him resist what he was about to do. Not because he was afraid, because he understood what these beings had been before the seeding, and what they were now, and that the distance between those two things was the measure of what the Volkai were. He fired. His aim was practical rather than elegant. He'd qualified on a range. He knew his weapon, and at this range in this corridor, what was required was steadiness, not skill. The first two converted crew members went down. The third reached the entrance before he could fire again, and it was Vorya who dealt with that, not with a weapon but with her bare hand, a strike that was so precisely placed that he filed it in the same mental category as her language acquisition and her knowledge of her ship's layout and her systematic resistance to the spore. Evidence of something. "How much longer?" he said. 60 seconds, she said. He used the 60 seconds. The converted crew kept coming, not many. There hadn't been many survivors to convert, and he kept meeting them at the entrance, and the fundamental advantage of the position was exactly what he'd hoped. One at a time, his angle, nothing clever required. Just willingness. Just the stubborn human refusal to move. "Done," Vorya said. The device on the wall was cycling through a sequence that his human eyes couldn't interpret, but that his body registered as a change in air pressure, in the ambient sound of the compartment, in something below the threshold of definition that he would later describe to the Sovereignty's debriefing team as a vibration that stopped. The converted crew member in the corridor, the last one, stopped. It didn't fall, it didn't collapse, it just lost orientation. The coherence went out of it like a light. It stood in the corridor with the specific blankness of a signal that had no recipient, and then, very slowly, it sat down. Decker lowered his weapon. The device needed 12 hours to propagate the countersignal through the local network. The nodes aboard the ship, the seeding agents that had been released into the region of space around it, the microscopic network architecture that the Volkai had been building in the dark for purposes that he was still processing. He and Vorya sat in the central compartment and waited. She spoke to him for most of that time. Her standard had become genuinely fluid by hour 4, the translator device beneath her ear working in concert with her own extraordinary facility for pattern recognition. She told him things about the Volkai that he understood. He was one of the first humans to hear. About the network's origin point, a system beyond the frontier that had been expanding for what she calculated was 400 years. About the Sovereignty's unknowing role in accelerating the expansion by establishing trade routes that gave the seeding vectors to follow. About the other civilizations along the expansion front, some of whom had been fighting the Volkai for generations without understanding what they were fighting. She told him about her people. Not everything. He understood she was being selective, not deceptive. There was a calibration in what she shared, a sense of information being offered in measured portions while she assessed something about him. He didn't push. He answered her questions honestly when she asked them, which she did with a directness that he appreciated, and he asked his own questions in the same spirit. At hour 7, she said, "You did not report finding me." "I started a report, I didn't finish it." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because if I'd finished it, a containment team would have been dispatched. By the time they arrived, you'd have been dead. And then we'd be having a very different conversation right now, if anyone was having any conversation at all." "You did not know who I was?" "No." "You knew I was alien, potentially hostile, potentially contaminated." "You were alive," he said. "That was still enough." She looked at him for a long time with those amber eyes. He had gotten better over the hours at reading her expressions, not decoding them exactly, but registering the currents of them. What he saw now was something that he thought, on a human face, he might have called reckoning. "I should tell you something," she said. "You've been telling me things for 7 hours. Something specific. A pause. My name, my full name, what I am. He waited. Among my people, she said, the title does not translate well. In standard, the closest approximation would be. She paused, working through the translation with the same concentrated precision she brought to everything. Empress, ruler, first of the settled systems. Another pause. 340 inhabited worlds, 8 frontier zones, 42 species under, not dominion. Something closer to trusteeship. Decker Cole sat with that for a moment. You're serious, he said. I am always serious. The most powerful being in a civilization that spans 42 species was on a scientific expedition personally. My people believe that leaders should understand what they govern. There was something in her voice that was both stated principle and lived defense. I have personally surveyed 40 of the 82 contested frontier systems under my administration. I was present at the discovery of the Volkai source point, because the decision about how to respond required understanding that my ministers could not have. He thought about this. About a woman, a being, who ran a 340-world civilization and showed up herself when the situation required it. He found that he was not, precisely, surprised. Your people, he said, do they know where you are? They know I am missing. Her voice was controlled, but he heard what was underneath it. The last signal from my ship was logged 9 days ago. By now, my second council will have activated succession protocols. We should contact them. Yes, she looked at him. But first, you should understand what it means that I am alive, what it means that you are the one who ensured it. I don't want anything from you, he said quickly, because it seemed important to say. I know, she said. That is exactly why I am telling you. The 12 hours completed. The countersignal finished its propagation, and the Volkai network in the surrounding space collapsed in a way that was both invisible and total. No explosion, no visible event, just an absence where a presence had been, like static clearing from a channel. The device on the wall went dark. The converted crew members aboard the ship, 3 of them, had recovered enough to be disoriented, but alive, sitting in corridors or compartments with the specific blankness of people who couldn't account for the last several hours. Decker went to each of them. He scanned them. The spore residue was inert. They would live. He made a note in his medical log. Then he went back to the Ardent Claws, and he finished his report. It was considerably longer than the one he'd started 11 hours ago. He flagged it Priority 1, which he'd never done in 11 months, and sent it through the emergency relay to the nearest sovereignty command post. He included the star map with Vorya's source point marked. He included everything. Then he sat in the crew compartment and drank terrible coffee and waited for the response. Vorya came and sat across from him. She had, he noticed, done something to her uniform. The damage was partially repaired. The layered material reassembled into something closer to its original configuration. She sat with the particular uprightness that he'd noticed in her since she'd recovered. A posture that he understood now was not stiffness, but a kind of default bearing, the way someone holds themselves when they are always being observed. What happens now, he said. My people will respond to my location signal within 6 hours. Your command will respond to your report within, she considered, longer. The sovereignty's response time from the outer verge is not its best quality, he agreed. When my people arrive, there will be a conversation between our civilizations. She looked at him steadily, a significant one. About the Volkai. Among other things, a pause, about the countersignal device, about the source point. About coordinated response. She tilted her head slightly. About the human who found an alien woman dying on a dead ship and went in anyway. I'm just a medic. You are, she said, and you are also the first point of contact between 2 civilizations that will need to work together to address a threat that neither can address alone. She let that settle. The sovereignty will want to know what happened here. My people will want to know as well. You will be central to that account. Decker thought about his posting, the outer verge, the patrol corridor that no one else wanted, the 11 months of careful invisibility. I was sent out here specifically so I'd stop being a problem, he said. I know, she said. I read your sovereignty file. Your scanner was displaying it when I found the display panel. He stared at her. You read my personnel file. You were operating on me with experimental compound sequences while I was semi-conscious. I wanted to know who you were. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling of the crew compartment, which had a minor water stain from a coolant seal that had been repaired imperfectly before his posting. He had looked at that stain many times in 11 months. It had never meant anything until now. The official account, he said, is going to be complicated. Yes. My command is going to want to know why I didn't file a report immediately. Yes. And your people are going to want to know how their Empress ended up being treated by a disgraced frontier medic with a compromised scanner and 3 compounds that weren't designed for your biology. Yes, she said, and there was something in her voice that was, unmistakably, the beginning of what would become something else over time. They will want to know all of that. And what will you tell them? She was quiet for a moment. That you were the right person in the right place at the right time, that those 3 things are not, in my experience, as common as they should be. Another pause. That the sovereignty lost something when it sent you to the outer verge, and my civilization gained something when your patrol route brought you to my signal. Decker didn't say anything for a while. Outside the porthole, the brown dwarf continued its ancient turning. The alien ship drifted alongside them, its lights still dim, its crew beginning to find their way back to themselves. The spore residue in your system, he said finally. I want to run another scan before your people arrive. The inert phase can reverse if the countersignal exposure was insufficient at cellular level. She looked at him with an expression he now had a name for. He'd seen it first in the containment unit, when he'd cracked the seal and gone in, and again at hour 40 minutes into the treatment when his 3rd compound started to work, and again when she'd told him who she was and he'd said he didn't want anything. It was the expression of someone recalculating, finishing the calculation this time. Yes, she said, run the scan. The Sovereignty Command Post responded 7 hours later. It was a terse acknowledgement that his report had been received and escalated, and that a response team was being dispatched. ETA was not provided, which was standard for anything escalated above his clearance level. Vorya's people arrived 4 hours after that. 3 ships, moving at a speed that politely suggested that the Sovereignty's fastest vessels were doing something different than maximizing velocity. They were smaller than their speed implied, compact, efficient, with the same organic curve to their hull geometry as Vorya's vessel, but dressed in running lights that left no ambiguity about their purpose. These were not scientific ships. The communication came first, a signal on a frequency that his comm panel registered, but that his translation software couldn't process. Then Vorya was at the panel, responding, and the exchange lasted 4 minutes, and when it was over, she turned to him with an expression that he had learned by now to read as a very specific kind of controlled. They are, she paused. Relieved is not the full word. We do not have a good standard translation for the specific state of someone who has been preparing for a succession and is abruptly required to unprepare for it. I imagine it's complicated. Considerably, a pause, they want aboard. Of course. I need to warn you about something first. She met his eyes. When they see me, when they see that I am alive and functional, there will be a protocol response that may seem extreme. It is not about you. It is about the protection of my person, which they failed to provide, which they will need to be seen to be providing comprehensively now. Weapons, he said. Briefly, yes. He thought about this. I've been shot at before, he said, mostly by accident. I don't recommend it, but I can handle briefly. She looked at him. You are a very strange human, Decker Cole. I've been told. I mean it as a precise description, she said, not a criticism. The escort team came aboard with the particular focused efficiency of people who had spent 11 days dreading a specific outcome, and were now redirecting that energy. There were 6 of them, all dressed in the same layered armor Voria wore, but more fully realized, and they moved through the ardent claws with weapons drawn, until Voria said something in a tone that was apparently the equivalent of standing down. And they did, and then they all looked at Decker with expressions he couldn't read at all. Voria spoke to them at length. He stood to the side and let it happen, watching the reactions move through the escort team, shock, relief, something that he thought might be the alien equivalent of disbelief, as she told them whatever she was telling them. Once, she held up her arm and showed them the healing tissue, and the reaction to that was visible and visceral. Once she pointed at him. The escort team all looked at him. He nodded, which was a gesture he was fairly sure didn't translate, but it was what he had. One of the escort team members did something then that he didn't expect. The being, gender indeterminate to him, though clearly distinct in some way to the others by their deference, stepped forward and placed a fist against the chest in a gesture that was unmistakably formal. A salute or something functioning identically to one, then stepped back. Decker looked at Voria. That, she said carefully, is an acknowledgement of debt. From my first commander. It does not happen. A pause. It has not happened to anyone not of our people in, she seemed to be calculating. The historical record does not have a precedent. He looked back at the first commander. He put his own fist against his own chest. He wasn't sure it meant the same thing, but the intent seemed to cross. The conversation between civilizations began 3 days later aboard a sovereignty relay station that had been repurposed for the purpose on 48 hours' notice. Decker was present for the opening. It seemed important to someone on both sides that he be there, and then tactfully excluded from most of it, which was appropriate because the discussion was well above the level of a frontier medic and involved people with titles and authority that he didn't have words for. He spent most of those 3 days in the relay station's medical bay, working. There were crew members from Voria's ship who had survived the spore infection and were in various stages of recovery. The conversion process reversed by the countersignal, but the reversal imperfect, biological systems trying to reestablish their original architecture. He worked through the problem methodically, developing a treatment protocol with the station's medical team and Voria's own doctors, a collaboration that was simultaneously frustrating and the most interesting work he'd done in 11 years. She came to the medical bay on the second evening, without escort, which he gathered was unusual enough that the station's sovereignty staff did not quite know how to respond. The conversations are going well, she said. I'm glad. The sovereignty's delegation understands the threat. She paused. They are less clear on the appropriate response, but that will come. They're good at appropriate responses once they've had time to prepare them, he said. I've been told that's a trait of mine as well. Yes, she said, with something in her voice that had been building since the central compartment of her ship, since the hour her standard became fluid, since the moment he'd said you were alive. That was enough. I have also been told that. She sat down across from him in the small office adjacent to the medical bay, and she looked at the work on his screens, the treatment protocols, the cellular architecture diagrams, the notes he'd been building, and she was quiet for a while. What happens to you now? She said. Probably a formal review, he said. I deviated from protocol 6 or 7 times by my count. Someone will want to have a conversation about that. The counter-signal device that you helped me deploy disrupted a Volkai network seeding operation that was already established in 3 sovereignty frontier systems, she said. We calculated this during the debrief. 40,000 possible exposure events prevented. That's the sovereignty's accounting to do. It will factor. Probably, he looked at his screens. I'm not worried about it. No, she said, I don't think you are. She was quiet for another moment. He waited because he'd learned that her pauses had structure to them. There will be a joint operational response to the Volkai, she said, a coordinated effort between our civilizations. It will require people who understand both the threat and the interface between us. He looked at her. My people's medical corps has never worked alongside the sovereignties, she said. The knowledge I watched you apply in my central compartment, xenobiological protocol, adaptive treatment sequencing, improvised compound application under field conditions, is not common, not in my civilization either. I've had an unusual career, he said. Yes, and then I would like to offer you a position as joint medical liaison, formally, with the sovereignty's endorsement, which I am told will be enthusiastic given the circumstances. He sat back in his chair. You are the galaxy's most feared Empress, he said. Among other things. And you're offering a job to the medic who fixed you with improvised compounds. I am offering a position to the most qualified person for a role that requires exactly what you demonstrated aboard my ship. A pause. The adaptation, the willingness to enter a situation without certainty and work the problem anyway, the specific kind of stubbornness that looks like courage from the outside. My last commanding officer described it as recklessness. Your last commanding officer sent you to the outer verge to be forgotten, she said. I don't think his assessment of your qualities is authoritative. Decker looked at his screens for a moment, at the treatment protocols, at the work that still needed doing. The patients in the next room, he said. I'd want to see them through the recovery phase. Of course. And the Sovereignty Review Board will have to complete their process. I have been told to expect that to conclude favorably within the week. He looked at her. You talked to them. I communicated the relevant context. A pause. I am frequently told that I am persuasive. He thought he understood, finally, what 340 worlds and 8 frontier zones actually meant. Not power in the abstract. Power used specifically, deliberately, with the same precise economy she brought to everything else. All right, he said. She didn't smile. He wasn't certain yet whether smiling was something her expressions did. But something in her face shifted, in the way it had shifted in the containment unit when he'd cracked the seal, in the way it had shifted at hour 40 when his compound started to work. The specific adjustment of someone who had finished a calculation and found the answer good. There is one more thing, she said. Yes. The treatment you developed for the spore infection, the compound sequencing. She held up her arm, the skin fully healed now, no trace of the darkening. My doctors could not have done what you did. I want you to understand that. What you improvised in that compartment, they have reviewed it. Several of them found it troubling. Troubling bad, or troubling as in the way that an elegant solution troubles a person who spent a long time working a harder path. Her voice was quiet. You will have things to teach us, Decker Cole, about adaptability, about improvisation, about the specific human characteristic of working a problem with whatever you have, in whatever time you have, for whoever needs it. He thought about the hour in the containment unit, the scanner readings cycling, the compounds in sequence, the amber eyes finding him in the moment she surfaced, watching him work, deciding something. You knew, he said, in the containment unit. You knew who I was. The file you read was in standard. Your translator was already working. Yes, she said. You knew I was a disgraced medic with an improvised treatment plan and no backup. Yes. And you let me work. You were there, she said. You had gone in. That told me what I needed to know. A pause. The spore had already reached my secondary organ systems. Whatever protocol a formally approved team would have used, I would not have survived its preparation time. You adapted, in real time, without certainty. She looked at him with steady amber eyes. That is not common in any civilization I have encountered. It is worth keeping. Outside the station's viewports, space was the same as it always was, vast, indifferent, full of things that hadn't been found yet, and things that had been found and wished they hadn't. The Volcae source point was still out there, beyond the frontier, broadcasting its coherent signal to a network that was already partially disrupted and would take months to finish collapsing. There was work to do. There would be more work after that. It didn't end. Decker thought about a dead frequency that he'd listened to long enough to hear a heartbeat in. He thought about a decision made in the 40 seconds between reading a scanner and picking up a contamination kit. He thought about the specific stubbornness of going into a situation without certainty and working the problem anyway. He thought some things are worth doing because the person needs them done. Some things are enough. When do we start? He said. Varya stood. She held out her hand, a gesture he recognized, and which he understood she had chosen deliberately, from his own file, from 11 hours of watching him, from the particular precision with which she approached everything. He shook it. We already have, she said.